Welcome to Excel Magic Trick number 1398. Hey, if you want to download this Excel workbook, Excel Magic Trick 1398 finished, or the start file so you could follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, we got a great video here where we're going to talk about DAX formulas for running total and percent of running total. And we'll see a few other cool DAX formula tricks. Now, the last couple videos have been all about running totals. We saw how to do running totals and percent running totals with pivot tables. And then we saw 3 different videos about formulas. But in this video, we want to see how to do it with DAX formulas. Now, here's our first data model pivot table using DAX formulas. And we need to create the categories with a lower and upper limit, 1 to 50, 51 to 100. And notice the increment for each one of these is the same. Each increment between lower and upper is exactly 50. Then we need DAX formulas to count. So there was 103 transactions that had quantity between 101 and 150. Then we need our running total. So that's cumulative running total through all 3 categories, 173. That means there were 173 transactions that had quantities of 150 or less. Then we need our percent running total or percent cumulative total. So 42% of our transactions had quantity of 150 or less. Now, our second data model pivot table will be based on month. And notice for any particular row here, we're going to calculate total quantity, which is different. We're going to be adding the quantity. Up here, we were counting. But we're going to add, then calculate a cumulative total and percent cumulative. But notice there's still a lower and upper limit here. Beginning of April is the lower limit. End of April is the upper limit. Both of these pivot tables have increments of the same. This is a month. This is 50. Then our third example, we'll see how to calculate categories where the increments are not the same. We have an increment of 75, 75, 50, and then 100. And in this data model pivot table, we'll actually count transactions based on the quantity column, and then we'll add total quantity for each category. All right, now we're going to close this finished file, and we're going to go to the start file. And I'm on the sheet tables. This is the quantity column in the fact table. Now, each one of these tables are in Excel, and I've already converted them to a table and named them. So if I go up to Design, the name of the fact table is F quantity. Now, some of these tables are already imported into the data model, and we'll go look in a second. Here's our product table, customer table, date table, fact table, and here are the 2 category tables. Now, we'll come back and look at these category tables in just a moment, but I want to go look in the data model because I've already imported the first 4 tables. I'm going to Power Pivot over to Data Model. We could see down here I have F quantity, D product, D customer, D date. Now we come up to Diagram View, and the relationship's already established. Here's our fact table. These are all lookup or dimension tables. Customers, there's a unique list of customers. That's the one side. Over to the many side. We can sell many transactions to each customer. The date or calendar table, that's a unique list of dates that span the full range of dates in our fact table. One of each date, unique list, that's the one side. Over to the many, we can sell many transactions for a given date. Here's our product table, a unique list of products. We have the one side over to the many side because we can sell that product many times. Now we want to import our first category table, then build a calculated column that will allow us to build a relationship between the fact table and our first category table. Alt-Tab. Now I'm going to click in this table. I've already converted it to a table and very carefully named it. It's D regular increments. Later in the video when we use this table, we will import it, and it will be D irregular increments. We'll also deal with this table in a really cool way in just a little bit. Now let's click in this table. Go up to Power Pivot. There's our Add to Data model. Now, we need to build this calculated column so we could build a relationship. But I want to go over to Data View and look. Notice here is our D-regular increments table. Those are the categories we'd like to use. There's the lower and upper. Now, in order to build a relationship, this is a dimension or lookup table, so I have to have a unique list. And I do. There are the upper limits. Now, I want to go look at the F quantity. Drag this down a bit. Here's our quantities. Now, I can't build a direct relationship between this table and the D-regular increments because in Power Pivot, there's not an approximate match lookup like there is in Excel. No problem. I want the upper limits listed as a calculated column. And I can do that in a simple way because the increments are the same. Notice 74, 174, 325. Well, what if I rounded all these up to the nearest 50? That would give us our calculated column that we could build a relationship upon. Now I'm going to double click the column header and name this irregular increments and enter. Now the formula we're going to use is equal sign that jumps me up to the formula bar is we're going to use the ceiling function. This will round up to the nearest 50. Now I've actually done a video on the ceiling function for exactly this calculated column to build a relationship to calculate frequency. But in this video, we're going to have a slight twist to how we did it last time. Now the number, I'm simply going to click on the first row, and notice what it does. It puts in the proper syntax when we're referring to an entire column, either for row context or filter context. It puts in the full table name, and then in square brackets, it puts the field name. Now, if you use Excel tables, you know that's the same syntax over there. But over here in the Power Pivot data model, that entire column, when the formula is copied down, will be the same in every single cell. It will know to get the correct quantity for each row in this table by something called row context. Now, over in Excel, if we had this, we'd have to put an @ symbol to get the formula to see each row. But over here in Power Pivot, it automatically does it because it's in a calculated column. As soon as you create a calculated column, row context will automatically happen. Now, comma, or significance, that's what we're rounding up to, 50. Now, last time we did this, we hard-coded this in, and we're going to start by hard-coding that 50 in. Enter. And just like that, we have our upper limit for each quantity. Now, this column can be used in a relationship. Now, we're going to build a relationship first, and then we're going to come back and change this formula. I'm going to go over to Diagram View. Here's the one side. Here's the many side. I'm going to click and drag and create our one-to-many relationship. Now, because there's a relationship, of course, we can drag category as a row label into our pivot table, and our formulas over here will respect just that particular category. Now, I want to go back over to Data View and click on the top cell. Last time I did this, we hard-coded this in, and someone posted in the comment, hey, how do we link this over to Excel? Well, let's see how to do that. I'm clicking Escape, Alt-Tab to jump back over to Excel. Now, I created a little increment table. And actually, in this table right here, I built formulas for each one of the rows. And if I change this to 25, watch what happens when I hit Enter. Everything is dynamic. Now, if you want to go look to see how I created this table, this is the video where we already did this. Now, I'm going to change this back to 50. And we'll test it later and see if this change will be reflected in the data model. Now, this is an Excel table. I already named it V increment for value increment. I want to import it. So Power Pivot, Add to Data Model. Now, there's our one column, one number table. We can see V increment down here. I want to go over to Diagram View. this would be a completely disconnected table. There will be no relationship. We simply have it here so we can access that value. Now let's go over to Data View, over to our F quantity, and here is our calculated column. I'm going to double click that 50, and we're going to use the values function. Now the value function can look at a particular column, and we're going to look at V increment in square brackets, tab, and values will automatically look through this column and deliver a unique list. Now, if the unique list is a single item, like it is in our case, values will not only deliver that, but it will convert it to a number value if necessary by the formula, which, of course, it is necessary for this formula. So when I hit Enter, now it is connected over to Excel using the values function. Now I'm going to Alt-Tab. Let's go ahead and change this 25 and Enter. Now normally if I did that, I would then pull this down and have the formulas create all the necessary categories. But I just want to go over and look in cell and see if the 25 is there, if the categories are there, and if our calculated column changed. Alt-Tab. If I go over to the V increment table, sure enough, that 25 changed. If I go over to D regular increments, sure enough, that changed. And if I go over to our helper column, look at that. The ceiling function calculated a new upper limit for each quantity in our table. Now I'm going to Alt-Tab and change it back to 50. All right, Alt-Tab. We're back to our helper column with the correct upper limits. Now back over to D regular increments, I actually want to start our pivot table and drop the category into the row label of the pivot table before we build our DAX measures for frequency running total and percent running total. So I'm going to click Pivot Tables. Over here, I'm going to click Existing Sheet, click the Collapse button. I'm going to go over to 1398 DAX and try A8. There it is. Click OK. Click OK. Now here's our pivot table field list. D regular increments, I'm going to drag category down to rows. And look at that. It is text, and it's sorted as text. 111, 222, 4, 5. We want 51 right after 1. No problem. We have to go back over to the data model, and we have to instruct Power Pivot Data Model to sort this column not as text, but as a number based on one of these other number columns. So I click in that cell, Home, Sort by Column. Click Sort by Column. There's the column we're going to sort, and here's the by column. Now we can pick either one of these. I'm going to pick Upper. Click OK. Now when I Alt-Tab, our categories are working perfectly. Now, I don't like that row label. I'm definitely going to go up to Design, Report, Layout, Show in Tabular. Now, let's talk about creating DAX formulas. And when we use a DAX formula in the values area, that's called a measure. We calculated one DAX formula already called a calculated column. Now we want to talk about what measures do. Now, measures in any cell in the pivot table will actually see that category. Now, remember, 201 to 250 is one row in the D increment table. As soon as the formula sits here, it sees that. The D increment table is filtered down to just this record with just that one upper limit, 250. And then the fact table with the upper limit of 250 is filtered down to just upper limits with 250. What that means is that whatever criteria we have in the row, column, slicer area always flows in and influences the formula. Now, sometimes that's what we want. Sometimes it's not what we want. For our first formula, that's what we want. So let's go back over to our Power Pivot Data Model. Just to remind you, diagram view. Remember, this table, when it's filtered down to one row, the filter flows across here and filters that table based on that one condition or criteria. Now let's go back over to Data View, over to F Quantity. This is the measured grid below our F Quantity table. we're going to create our measure here because then it will show up in that pivot table field list. Now, the way we create a measure is we first type the name. And as soon as I start typing, I jump up to the formula bar, and there is my measure name. Now, to separate the measure name from the rest of the formula, we have to type colon and an equal sign. Now, if the Power Pivot data model tables are all about filtering, and the fact table is going to be filtered down just to a particular upper limit, then all we have to do for frequency is use the count rows function. And then as the argument, we simply give it a table, FQ tab. That is the beauty of DAX. It's all about filtered tables. Now, when I hit Enter, it gives us a total of 409. That's exactly how many transactions are in the F quantity table. And of course, 409 is the answer down here. And by the way, this is called the measure grid because we can put all of our measures down here in this grid. But the reason it's 409 is because this is not in a pivot table. There's no row, column, slicer criteria to filter down the table. But when we come over to our data model pivot table and open up F quantity, hey, look, there's our measure. We always know this is a measure because the F of X icon means that is a measure. When we click and drag down to values, check that out. For any cell in the table, what happened? It's not 409. Well, down here it is. But right here, what happened? That criteria flowed into the measure. The D increment table filtered down to just 101, 150, which, of course, on that row, the upper limit is 150. The fact table then got filtered down through that relationship down to just the records with an upper limit of 150. And what did this do? It counted the rows. That means there are exactly 103 transactions that have a quantity between 101 and 150. Down here, there is no filter context coming from the row, so we see our grand total. Now, our next formula is going to be a running total. And this gets a little bit tricky because unlike Excel, where we can actually have an expandable range as we copy the formula down, we can't really access these directly. What we're going to have to do is get clever. If I want the running total right here, which is the total of all these, I'm going to have to filter down the category table to just these three categories. That means through the relationship, there will be an upper limit of 50, 100, and 150. The actual fact table will be filtered down just to records with 50, 100, and 150 upper limit. So how do we do that? Well, we're actually going to have to change the filter context. Because remember, the running totals formula is going to be sitting right here and trying to look at that one category. But we need it to see all three. Now, the way we can change the filter context, Alt-Tab, back over to our data model, is by using the amazing calculate function. Now, right below our first measure, I'm going to type the measure name running total. Now, it jumps it up here, colon, equal sign. And I'm going to type the letter C, because to get calculate, all you need is C and tab. Now, the calculate function will allow us to change the filter context. We put some formula where it says expression, and then we're allowed to add new filters that can change the filter context. Now, the formula we want to change is this measure down here. I'm going to type a square bracket. I see in square brackets the name of my measure, tab. Now, the convention for DAX formulas is that when you use a measure, you only use square brackets, no table name. Now, we need to change the filter context, comma. Now, one thing we need to understand about calculate is that the actual filter context from the pivot table will flow into calculate, but we can change it. And the way we're going to change it is by using the filter function. Now, the filter function is an iterating function that will iterate over a table and give you a valid list of values. Remember, for us, if we're in the third cell in the pivot table, we need the first three categories. Now, the table we need to look at then is the D regular table, tab. Now, the problem with this is, remember, pivot table criteria or filter flows in. So that table will actually be filtered down to the single category for that particular cell. But no problem. Watch this. There's a great function that'll rip away all the filters on a table, the all function. All strips away all the filters on that particular table. So when I close parentheses, now what all is delivering to that table argument is the full table. Now remember that table has 1, 2, 3 columns, category, lower, and upper. Now, comma, once we've stripped away all the filters, now we can put one of the columns from that table and ask a question of it. So D regular, I want to ask the question of the upper column, tab. Now, that's the full column, every single upper value. But I need to ask the question, how many of you are less than or equal to? And now the tricky part is I need to actually get the upper limit for the particular pivot table cell we're sitting in. Now, actually, we can do that because the criteria flowed in, all ripped it all away. This is the full column. But if we use an aggregate function right here, the actual criteria will flow into it. Now, I'm going to use the max function and then D regular of the upper. Now, really, remember, this is a dimension or lookup table. So there's a unique list there. So when the filter flows in, there'll actually only be one value here. And you could actually prove that to yourself. You could use the min or the sum here. Any aggregate function that would give us that one value would work. Now, in our next example, when we do dates, the max actually will have to look at the full series of dates for a month. And so max will pick out the end of the month date. But for us, that will work. Now, I'm actually going to prove that to you. Watch this. I'm going to do something crazy. I'm going to highlight all of the first part of this formula before the max, Control X. And now I want to just hit Enter. And there's our formula, which is completely wrong. But I want to go over to the pivot table, click inside of here, and this is the wrong formula. But I want to show you that this aggregate function, in fact, will pick out the upper limit. Alt-Tab. Now watch this. I'm going to come up here, Control-V. All right, so there we go. That is our condition in the filter expression argument. Now, when I close parentheses on filter, remember, filter's job is to deliver a list of valid values as criteria for calculating this frequency for quantity. Well, of course, if we're in the third cell, it will deliver the first three rows of this D regular increments table, which will work fine. Now, I need to close parentheses on calculate and enter. Now, 409, of course, because there is no filter context here. But when I Alt-Tab, look at that. That is our running total. For any particular cell, it's trying to calculate the actual original frequency function. But filter and all delivers, in this case, these 5 rows of the table, which then allows the fact table to be filtered just on those 5 upper limits. And we see there's 310 transactions. All right, now our next calculation is going to be percent of running total. So I need to compare this formula here to the actual grand overall total. Alt-Tab. Come down below here. I'm going to type percent running total, colon, equal sign. And we're going to use the divide function because I'm calculating the proportion or percentage of 2 items. Now, we're going to use divide because we can put a numerator and denominator. And if there were ever an error, we can put alternative result here. Or if we leave it empty, it will display nothing using the blank function. So the numerator is going to be our running total, tab, comma. Oh, wait a second. The denominator, I need the grand overall total. And this formula will see the filter context. So how do I rip away all of the filter context on the F quantity table to get the grand overall count? Well, first I'm going to use the calculate function because that allows us to change the filter context. And for the expression, I actually can use either one of these because if I rip all the filters away, either one of them will give us 409 because there's 409. I'm going to use running total tab, comma. And what's the name of the function that rips away all of the filters? The all function. Now we're looking at a calculation on the F quantity table, so I'm going to take away all of the filters from the F quantity. Now, all will deliver the full table to this filter argument, which means then running total will calculate without any filters. Now, close parentheses on calculate. Calculate is just the denominator. There's the numerator. We want the default, close parentheses, enter. Now, I'm going to add some number formatting, percentage number formatting, Alt-Tab. Now I come over to the pivot table. There it is, our new measure. Drag it down, and there's our percent running total. When we get down here, 75% of the transactions had quantity of 250 or less. Now, for this example, we were counting, and then we did a running total and percent running total. Now we want to calculate our second pivot table down below, and we want to try and do it for year and month. Now I'm going to build my pivot table with year and month first. Now notice I'm not over in the data model, but I can still access the data model with a pivot table. Insert pivot table, or I can use the keyboard Alt-N-V. Now notice the default is it's assuming we want it because there is a data model in this Excel workbook. Existing sheet is fine. Click OK. Now let's scroll down. And from the D date, I'm going to drag year down to rows. Month name down below years. Now, notice these are text items, and they're sorting correctly. I actually already did that sort by column. I told the month column to sort by the month number. All right, I don't like the row labels there, so I go up to Design, Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Now we're going to do something similar here, but not the same. Here we're counting. Here I want to actually add the quantity, then get a running total and percent running total. So for our first measure, simply adding, we want to see the exact row context. So Alt-Tab, we come down a couple cells, and I'm going to call this total quantity colon equal sign, and we're simply going to use the sum function. FQ, down arrow to quantity, close parentheses. That's an aggregate function, and we'll see all the filter context. I want to add some number formatting, comma, and then reduce the decimals. Alt-Tab to go back to our new pivot table. F quantity. There's our new measure. Click and drag. And so there is the running total. There's the total for 2017. Here's the total for 2018. Now, our running total, we're going to do a similar formula. And we'll use calculate using that measure. We'll use filter. We'll strip away, we're using the all function, all the filters from the date column. Then we'll use the actual day column, and we'll use the max of the date column. And remember, when max is in this cell right here, it's looking at all the dates for June. So the max would be the end of the month. Now, we're going to create that formula, drop it in here, and see that there's a slight problem, and then we'll fix it. Alt-Tab. I'm going to call this cumulative total colon equal sign C-tab, square bracket, and total quantity is the expression of the formula I want to change the filter context for, comma. And filter, we're going to use filter. All, and we want the D date, the actual whole date table, close parentheses. Now filter is going to iterate over the entire date table, comma. And the column I want to look at is DD, the actual individual days. That column is the full column because of that all function, which is what we want for cumulative. We're starting by looking at every date in the date table. Then I need to say, hey, how many of you are less than or equal to, and we're going to use that aggregate function max, which now is allowed to see the filter context, dd date tab, close parentheses. So filter has the full table, the full column, less than or equal to the max date for any particular month, close parentheses on filter. Filter will deliver a list of valid dates. Those valid dates will flow across the filter to the fact quantity table, and total quantity will be able to calculate. Now, there will be a problem here, but we will fix it. I'm going to close parentheses and enter. I'm going to add some number formatting, comma, decrease the decimal, Alt-Tab, click inside here. Now, cumulative total. It actually, when we drop it down here, will be the cumulative total for both years. Now, actually, sometimes that's what you want. Notice when it gets to 2017, it's continuing its cumulative total. Now, if we don't want this, and I don't think we want this here, I want this as a total, and then I want it to restart for the new year. Well, we need to change the filter context. Remember, for the date table, we ripped away all of the filters. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to add back the proper year. So it will first rip away all the criteria, and then it will add back the particular year. Alt-Tab, I'm coming up to the formula bar. And at the very end, before the last closing parentheses on calculate, I see now I'm inside of calculate. Filter 1, I type a comma to get to filter 2. And now, since we want year, we're going to use the values function. Values function gives us a unique list from a particular column. So I'm going to down arrow to year, close parentheses. Now, values is sitting out here in calculate, so of course, the filter context will flow in. When it is in a cell for the year 2017, values will deliver the year 2017 as a valid year. And filter 1, which is our valid lists of dates, that's the first filter. Filter 2, that's for 2017 only. These two filters will work in an AND logical test. So it'll have all the dates less than or equal to whatever the last day of the month is. And it's also got to be for a particular year. That AND logical test will run. The results from that AND logical test flow across the filter to the F quantity table, and total quantity will be able to calculate. So I'm going to hit Enter. Alt-Tab. And now we see we get cumulative total down to 39311 for 2017, and it starts over for 2018. Now we have one more calculation, Alt-Tab. We want percent cumulative, colon, equal sign. We're using the divide function, square bracket, cumulative total tab, comma. We need to remove the filters and add back the years. So we're changing the filter context. So I'm going to use the calculate. The expression, I'm going to use cumulative total, comma. Now there's a few ways we could do this. I'm going to use the all. Well, wait a second. I could use the all and then add the years back in. But watch this. I'm going to tab. I'm going to use all except. So the table I want to rip away all the filters from, the date table, comma. The one I don't want to remove is DD, the actual year. Close parentheses. So all except will remove all filters from the date table except for year, and then deliver a list of valid values to calculate, so cumulative total can calculate the total for the particular year. Now I'm going to, on the calculate, close parentheses. On the divide, close parentheses, enter. I'm going to add some percentage number formatting. Alt-Tab. Now I have my percent cumulative total. Drag it down here. And look at that. There's our percent cumulative total. So for this August 2017, 65% of the total units for the year were sold by the end of August. The actual number of the units was 25,651. And now down here we have a new percent running total. All right, so for these first two examples with DAX formulas, both of them had the same increments for each category. This was a month. This was 50. Now our next example, I want to do the same type of counting or calculating the frequency of count for quantity. And then I want to also add. But our increments for our categories are not going to be the same. Now we need to go over and add the tables. From the table sheet, I need to add this to the data model. So I'm going to go up to Power Pivot, Add to Data Model. There are our irregular categories. I'm going to go over to Diagram View. I would like to, similarly like we did for this table, add the upper limit for each transaction, build a relationship. Now, this is going to be much more complicated than when we have increments that are the same for each category. And the logic of what we're going to use for this formula is going to simulate how we would do approximate match lookup. Because if we had an approximate match lookup like VLOOKUP or index and match over in Excel, we'd simply look this up over in that table and retrieve the upper limit. All right, so I'm going to double click this column and call this upper irregular increments and enter. Now, I would like to simply come up here and use the max function. And we're going to type DI to get to D irregular increments. I would just like to get the max of that upper column over there. And I wish it could do filter context where this aggregate function could see criteria coming from a pivot table. But that's not going to happen here. When we have a calculated column, it does row context. So when I hit Enter here, an aggregate function in a calculated column just gives you the max from the D irregular upper column. But guess what? We can use calculate here and the filter function to do something similar and get the max function to calculate over just a certain number of rows in the table. And it's going to be based on the quantity. Now, this formula here uses row context, so we can access these quantities in our formula. Now, if I ask the question like, hey, that quantity right there, how many over in the irregular lower column, how many of those values are less than or equal to this 74? That would get us the right number of rows that could flow to filter that table, and then the max could calculate just on those filtered values. So we're going to use calculate, C-tab. That's the expression right there that we're trying to calculate, but comma. We're going to change the filter on that D irregular table. Filter. Now I want to DI and get that irregular increments table. And guess what? I don't have to use all here because I'm not in a pivot table. There's no pivot table filter context flowing in. So that's the table I want to iterate over, comma. The column is DI down arrow lower. So filter will allow us to look at this column and ask a question of each item in that list. How many of you are less than or equal to, and watch this, I'm going to click on the quantity for this first row. There's the table name and the field name in square brackets. Through row context, that 74 will be in our formula. So for 74, since the first upper limit is 75, this whole column will be reduced down to the first row only. Close parentheses. Filter will deliver that first row, which means the table is filtered. Max D irregular increments upper will calculate and pick out the correct upper limit. Close parentheses on this calculate filter and enter. You got to be kidding me. Look at that. Now we can build our relationship. I go over to Diagram View. Upper, I'm going to drag it to upper irregular increments. There's the one to the many. And guess what? we can, since frequency for quantity and total quantity are functioning on this fact table, when I drag a category here, this table will be filtered down, flow across here, and those two calculations will work with our irregular incremented table. Alt-Tab, right here, Alt and V. I should have actually used the button over there, but that's OK. There it is, data model. That's the correct cell. Click OK. That's probably faster anyway. Now here's our D irregular increments. There's our category. Whoops, I forgot to Alt-Tab, Data View, irregular increments. Click in this column. We need to sort it based on the upper or lower. Sort by column. Sort by column. I'm going to select the column upper. It could be either one. Click OK. And now that column is being sorted in accordance to that number. Alt-Tab. That's sorted correctly. I don't like row labels. Design, report layout, show in tabular. Now I can come down to F quantity. Frequency for quantity, but now we have a count in accordance with our new categories. There's our total quantity. You got to be kidding me. Boom. All right, that was a lot of fun with building data model pivot tables for frequency, running total, and percent running total. We saw how to count both with categories that had increments that were the same each time and different. And we saw how to add and calculate running totals for each particular year and percent running total. All right, that was a lot of fun with DAX formulas. We'll see you next video.